Today's daf is daf Nun Aleph. Now, we were talking about a uh, a scab that was formed as a result of some sort of an injury in the animal, and obviously there was a puncture, and it was covered by the scab. And the old issue is when did this happen? Before the shechita or after the shechita? So the Gemara says the following, and these are the last few words on Daf Nun Amud Beis, that Nimtza Aleha Koredam, if you find that there's a needle, let's say in the base, in the ovi base hakosos, and you find a spot of blood on the needle, then you know for sure biyadua on the top of Daf Nun Aleph shelifnei shchita, that this puncture took place before the shchita, because right after the shchita you found the needle inside the innards of the animal. And the fact that there's dam there means that it was punctured. The animal was suffering for that. But lo nimtza le'akar dam b'yadu shliachar shchita. If you didn't find any dam on the needle itself, then you have every right to assume that this situation of a suffix, where you don't know, you can definitely assume that it happened after the shechita and it's kosher. Now we talk about scabs. Higlid, which means it became scabbed. Pi hamaka, the opening of the wound. Biyadua sheshloshi yomim kodem shechita, meaning since right after the shechita you found the scab, then it takes 3 days for the scab to form around the opening of the wound. So therefore, two nafkaminas, two halachic implications. Number one, you now assume that the animal was a treifa because it had this wound already 3 days ago and you found it today, but you know that it was there 3 days ago before the shechita. But there's an interesting other nafkamina which the Gemara points out here. As far as the laws of mekach tos, what does that mean? If I buy an animal from you, I buy it on the assumption that it's a healthy animal, it's kosher, and I can shecht it and eat its meat. If, on the other hand, lo and behold, I discover that it's a treifa, then I want my money back. And, the whole deal, the whole sale is off because it was done under false pretenses. So therefore, the Gemara says that assuming the transaction in which, let's say, Shimon bought Reuven's animal took place, let's say, more than 3 days ago, then it was not necessarily a treifa that time. But if it took place within the last 3 days, and we know from the scab on the wound that it was already had this internal organ punctured before the sale, the transaction took place, then the halacha is going to be that the buyer, let's say we call him Shimon, has a right to get a refund on his money and give back the animal and, let Reuven do whatever he wants with the animal. But lo higlid piyamaka, if on the other hand, we don't know exactly when the wound would have occurred, and therefore we're not going to assume that the animal had this wound at the time of the sale. And now the burden of proof shifts on the buyer, meaning on Shimon. He's got to prove that the animal was already a treifa before the sale. And that's called hamotzi mechaver levaraya. Now, we said that if you didn't find dam on the needle, then we assume that the animal's kosher. So the Gemara asks, "Maishna mikol nekuve bialma." Right? Whenever we find a puncture in an animal, we don't necessarily have to find dam. We assume that the animal has a puncture to its internal organ, then it's a treifa. Diafal gav deleka dam, tarif, we always assume that it's treif. And Mar is referring to an anonymous master, one of the Amoraim, who taught us that whenever you find a puncture in an animal, it's treif. So why do you put all the emphasis on the fact that you found dam on the needle, even if you didn't find dam on the needle? So Gemara makes the following distinction. Hasam leka midi lemisrach. But hacha keva de ika machat, I isa de kodem shchita hu misrach havi sorach. What happens is the Gemara says that blood will adhere to a needle. And therefore, if this needle actually punctured the organ, then we have to find blood. But leave out the case of a needle, and that's the case of the leka midi lemisrach, meaning we don't have anything to indicate that the puncture happened after the shechita. There's no reason to assume so. And the lack of blood doesn't prove a thing. In the case of a needle, the lack of blood proves very, very much that there was no puncture, because otherwise it should be a bloody needle. Amalei Rav Safra Abaye, Chazi mar hai tzurba mirabanan di asa mimarava. And now Rav Safra is talking to Abaye. Mar, therefore, which is my master, he's talking in third person to Abaye. And Rav Safra is asking Abaye, did you happen to encounter a certain Tzurba Rabbanon, a scholar that came from Eretz Yisrael? And who did I have in mind, says Rav Safra? The Omar of Avira Shemeni. And the person that I have in mind, this scholar, is called Rav Avira Shmani. Shmani probably is the place that he came from. And what tradition do we have in the name of Rav Avira? The Omar, Maisu Bolfnei Rebbe. Rebbe is referring to Rabbi Yehuda Nossi. This is very interesting that it seems that this Rav Avira was a contemporary of Rabbi Yehuda Nossi. And Abaye and Rav Safra are generations after that. So that's very strange how they work this out historically. In any event, Machat shenimtzeis bi ovi beis hakosos. Right, there was a needle that was found in the ovi beis hakosos, and the question is whether or not that proves that the animal is a treifa, because normally a hole in the beis hakosos would indicate that the animal is a treifa, but apparently there are two coverings over the beis hakosos. And the question is whether this needle pierced through both the outer and the inner, coverings. And it was only mitzad echad. So they found the needle only on the one side, let's call it the inside. And Tarfa, nevertheless, Rebbe paskin that the animal is treif. Sholachle, when Abaye heard this tradition from Rav Safra in the name of Rav Avira, he sent a message to this Rav Avira, who apparently was a contemporary of Abaye, but as I said before, that's problematic. And lo asal gabe, like Dosan Vavira in last week's parasha, he said, "Oh no, I'm not coming to you. You got to come to me." Asal hulagabe, Abaye was humble, so he went to see Rav Avira, and again he wants to hear this story about Rabbi Yehuda Nossi. Havi koya igra. Now he finds that Rav Avira is on the roof. Omar nechus mar v'nesei. So Abaye says to him, "Please, Mar, my master, come down from the roof, come over to me. I have something to discuss with you." Lo nochas. So once again, Rav Avira says, "I'm not coming down." What was he doing on the roof? I have no clue. So therefore, Solak Hu Legabe, Abaye says, "Okay, I got to go up to the roof." Now, the whole background here for all the tircha that Abaye goes through is because what Rav Avira is going to tell him is like so simple in Abai's mind that Abai wants, so why did I put all this effort to come all the way over here and climb up on the roof to hear something that's pshita? Amalei Emily Gufa de Uvda Hechi Havi. Please tell me, Rav Avira, what was the story in which Rebbe gave his psak that the animals trafe? Amalei, so Rav Avira responds, Mafter Kinesios Ana Li Ela Mi Rebbe Rabba. He calls Rebbe Rabba, the Rebbe the Great, because Rebbe was the Nasi. And Rav Avira identifies himself as the Maftir. What is the Maftir? Apparently, the word Maftir in the Knesiot, in the congregations, the synagogues, is the person who's in charge of admitting or dismissing yeshiva students. Vahavi Rav Huna Tzipora, and Rav Huna, who came from Tzipora, and Rabbi Yossi came from Da'ah, Yoshvin Lefanov, they're sitting at the feet of Rebbe, Ubas Lifnei Rebbe, and while this is going on, somebody brought in a case of a machat shenimseis biobe beis hakosos mitzad echot. So the needle was embedded in the wall of the beis hakosos, but only on the inside. But hafacha Rebbe turned it over in order to see what it looked like on the outer skin, meaning that the only apparent piercing was the puncture on the inner skin. And now Rebbe wants to check out, was there also another puncture on the outer skin, which would definitely make it treif. And Matzoleh, when he looked at the outer skin, what did he find? Kart dam, a spot of blood. So that indicated that this needle penetrated not only the outer wall or thickness of the Beis HaKosus, but even the inner wall. Utarfa, and therefore Rebbe decided that the proper ruling would be that the animal is treif. And then he declared, Rebbe, in Ein Shal Maka Koretam Minayin. Now the word minayin here is a little bit tricky because usually the word minayin means how do I know and derive a halachic conclusion. Here the word minayin means where did it come from? And it's a sort of like a rhetorical way of saying it didn't come from from nowhere. So if there's a wound with a blood, then we know the wound, that we can assume the blood came from the wound. But if, on the other hand, I look on the outside of the Beis HaKosos, which he did when he turned it upside down, and lo and behold, there was no wound there, then I would say, okay, it's kosher. But now I found a wound and how do I know there was a wound? Because there was a spot of blood there. And where did the spot of blood come from? It must have come from a wound. So it means that the spot of blood is proof positive that there was a piercing of the outer thick layer that surrounds the Beis HaKosos. Now, if I says to Rav Ava, you worked me very hard here. I had to come to you, and I had to climb up to the roof, and so forth and so on. Is Torah Tarche Lahu Gavra? Abai speaks about himself in the third person. You are matriach. You troubled that man, meaning myself, and masnisin. I don't need you to tell me that a nekev, a piercing in the Beis HaKosos, makes the animal treif. Masnisani, that's our Mishnah. The Mishnah says, Hamaseis u Beis HaKos shenikfu lachutz, is then it's a treif. Lachutz meaning not only the inner skin, but also the outside skin. But the truth is that Rav Avira, in the name of Rabbi, is definitely telling us one chiddush, that if you don't know whether or not indeed it was punctured on the outside layer, then check it out. Is there blood? Is there not blood? Okay, but that, I guess, according to Abaye, is simple. So now we start a new Gemara about Nephila. So just a few words of simple introduction. As I said to Steve at the outset, this is a very easy daf. Baruch Hashem, we finally got to something that's a little bit easier. And you know how today, especially for people, okay, I don't know, you guys are a little younger than me, but in our age bracket, they talk, the worst thing is to fall. Just don't fall. Okay, so this Gemara is not about human falling, but about animals and birds that fell. And the question is, when an animal takes a fall, do we assume it must have broken some of its bones and therefore became a treifa? So in the case of Nafla min Agag, our Mishnah says that if it fell from a roof, now that's a pretty serious fall. And the question is, a roof is usually a minimum of 10 tefachim high, and the nefula is a reference to an animal that fell a minimum of 10 tefachim. And the question is, does the animal know or have the expertise to break its fall in such a way that it'll catch itself before there's what's called risuk evarim and its bones, let's call it a concussion of the bones. Omar Avhuna, hiniach behema lamala ubo matza lamata. What happens if you left an animal on the roof and now you found it on the bottom, on the ground? Ein choshim mishum risuke avodim. We don't have to assume that there was a concussion in the limbs, and we're going to assume that the animal was smart enough or expertise to get down from the roof, and instead of falling clumsy and breaking its bones, the animal was smart enough to know how to descend from the roof on its own, and therefore we have no chash of a concussion of the limbs. Now, what about a goat? Here's a story of a goat. Tahu Gadya, Dahavi Leila Ravina. Ravina owned a goat. Dechaza Chulsha Be'ipuma. So the animal on the roof looked through a Ipuma is a skylight. And what did it notice there? It noticed a Chulsha. Chulsha means barley, peeled barley on the floor. Dogar. Dogar means it took a leap. Nafal mi igra went from all the way up on the roof, liara down below. Asi l'kami de Rav Ashi. So now Ravina came before Rav Ashi and wanted to know, can the goat be considered kosher or is it treif? Amalei, Ravina responds, and he says, Hadi Amar Rav Huna, Hiniach behema lamalu motzo ubo motzo lamaten choshen mishum risa kavanin. We have that statement that we assume the animal knew how to get down from a high roof. How do we understand that? Mishum de isle midi lemisrach. Is it because there's something on the bottom that, or maybe, what's the language here? Lemisrach. Oh, it seems that when you go down from a roof, misrach means to grab onto something. So that the reason why Rav Huna is going to assume that the animal knew how to get down from the roof is because it's a roof that has something lemisrach, meaning something from the edge of the roof that you could hold on to and gradually come down to the ground. But high, when your goat, Ravina, fell down through the skylight in the middle of the room, then lesle midi lemisrach. There was nothing to hold on to and to break the fall. and therefore we should really consider it as a treifa, as a concussion to the limbs, risak avarim, odilma, or should we say no? Mishum the omda nafsha, the animal was smart enough to gauge whether or not it could make that jump safely, and an animal has a natural avoidance of jumping from a height from which it can't guarantee its own safety. And therefore, let's go with the other side and assume that the goat would certainly have jumped through the skylight, knowing full well, gauging itself that it's capable of making the jump without breaking its bones. And this is the vacillation back and forth between Ravina and Ravashi, Omole. So the answer was that Mishum Diyom Nafshi. We have a way or a principle by which we can assume that the animal knew how to gauge itself and jump without breaking its bones, and it could break its fall, and therefore your goat is kosher. Hahi imrasa. Imrasa is a young sheep. Dahavi bei Rav Chaviva. It's very interesting. Today, the word Chaviva is usually a name for a girl with a hey at the end, but Chaviva with an aleph is referring to a man. Davi Shadron Kare Basraisa. The animal, this young animal, is dragging its hind legs. Why is that so? Is it a break to the spinal column, which would mean it's a treifa? Omar Rav Yemar, Hai Shigrona Nakte. You should not attribute this to a break in the spinal column, but rather Shigrona. Now, I'm not sure what the word Shigrona means. Probably it has something to do with like tiredness or tight muscles. Sometimes the muscles become very tight and cramped and you're not able to move it. So it's dragging its legs. But that doesn't mean that it's treifa. But maskefle Ravina said, Vidilma chut hashidrifsak. How do you know that it wasn't the spinal cord that was severed, in which case the treifa, and that's why it's dragging its feet? But kuha ashkaid kiravina. And indeed, they checked it out after they shechted this small sheep, and they found that Ravina was right, that there was a severance of the spinal cord. Nevertheless, the Gemara comes to the conclusion that Kilchsak Rav Yemar, that as a general rule, an animal that's dragging its hind legs is kosher. Shigrona shchiach chut hashigolo shiach. So the Gemara says that when you have a suffix in treifa, you go basar shchiach. Shchiach means, that which is more commonplace. And if your choice is the animal dragging its feet because it's got some sort of problem, or is dragging its feet because it can't control its feet at all, it's got a break in its spinal column, then we go basar shchiach. And what's more shachiach, more common, is that the animal had this cramp in its leg and it can't stand on the feet. Amar Afuna, Zecharim Hamanagchim Zetze. These are rams that are butting each other, right? They're sort of like a fencing match. Ein Choshem Mishum Risuke Avarim. We don't have to assume that there's a concussion of the limbs. The animals are kosher. And what's the chiddush here? Afal Gav Dimitvuye Vekaime. Now, Davui, like, I don't know if you've ever heard it when they they go to be Menachem Avelim, say, what's the word that I'm looking for? Ledava Od. That you should no longer have divui. Divui means like suffering. So now, these two rams that were at each other in this battle are in pain. And therefore, if they're in pain, let's assume that they have sustained some sort of concussion. No, we're going to assume that Simra bi'alma hu dinokit lahu. Simra is the Aramaic for a fever. We're going to assume that they have a fever. Fever is something that goes away. It's not a vital kind of injury. Enough liara, but if on the other hand they fell to the ground as a result of this battle, then vare chayshina, then certainly we have to be concerned that if the animal suffers continuous pain, then it must be that there was some sort of risuk avar. Omar Benashi, Hani Dichre are rams, de ganve. The thieves stole it. And Rashi adds, and after they stole it, they threw it over the wall of the yard in order to steal it. So they stole it in a certain yard, and then they threw it over the wall of the yard. Ein choshem mishum risak avon my timer, ki shodile amasnayu shodilahu. Now look, the thieves want to take this ram home with them. So they're going to be careful about the way they throw them over the wall. And they're very careful to throw it on that the animal should land on its loins rather than on its back. If an animal lands over a wall on its back, it's risa kevarim, it's a treifa. But if on the other hand they land on their legs or their loins, then because they want the rams to go ahead, and they have no intention of returning the rams. But Adrinu, let's say these Ganovim do tshuva. I don't know why they get cold feet. They're afraid the police are after them or whatever, and therefore they want to return the animal. So therefore, Hani Mili Adrinu Machmas Yira, if they were afraid of the police, and therefore they want to return the animal and do tshuva, aval machmas tshuva ma'al yisahu diavdi. So they're going to return the animals in a way that they can return the animals without the animals injuring. So again, let's distinguish between the following. If the thieves are afraid of getting caught, or they're going to just throw it they couldn't care less about where it lands. Let it land on its back and become a treifa. Then we're going to assume it's a treifa. But if on the other hand, they really want to do tshuva, and they really want to return the animals, they're going to return it carefully. They're going to throw it in a way that it'll land on its loins. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Marav, Hika al Roshav, if a man takes a stick and he strikes the head of an animal, v'holcha klapis nova, the stick went all the way down to the tail, al znova, v'holcha klapi rosho, if the stick struck the animal on the tail and it went all the way, the stick went all the way to its head. Keneged, a third case, kol ashidra kula, the stick struck along the entire length of the spine. And in all these cases, we would have assumed that the animal suffered such a strike that it certainly became a treifa. Ein choshin lo mishum risuk evarim, the animal is still treif. Why is it so? Because when the person hit the animal with a stick, he made sure not to kill the animal. He's not interested in killing the animal and losing it and becoming a treifa and creating a concussion of the limbs. So what does he do? He avoids the back of the animal. Because ish sholid chutra, if the stick ends up apalge de gaba in the middle of the back, chayshinon, then we have to assume that the force of the blow would have created a concussion of the limbs. The e isbe kitre. And forget about the case where it extended to the middle of the back. Let's talk about any of the other cases where it, extended the length of the spine and so forth and so on. But isbe kitre, the stick has knobs on it. If the sticks have knobs on it, then that rough part of the stick, which we call kitri, the knobs, would have caused a concussion of the limbs of the animal. If the animal exhibits a certain kind of a motion, in other words, we assume that if the animal got hit in the back where the spine is, it will respond with this kind of a cleaving motion. And therefore, we're going to assume that this blow would have caused the animal to be a treifa. Omar Rav Nachman, what about birth? When an animal gives birth and the newborn baby exits through a very narrow birth canal, which is called the Beis HaRechem, Ein bo mishum risuk avanim. This is a natural birth, and in a natural birth, we're not concerned about a possibility of concussion of the limbs. And even though the animal, the mother animal, forces and projects the newborn baby through the passage in the narrow birth canal, we can assume that the animal, the newborn babe, is healthy. Now, normally, the halacha is that if you have a chashash that maybe there is a concussion, then you have to wait a day, a minimum of 24 hours. In this case, we don't even require you to wait before you shech the newborn animal for 24 hours. Amalei Rav of Nachman, Tanya the Messiah, I want to bring you a brisa to support what you say about the natural birth of an animal, and to assume that there's no concussion, even though the mother forced the newborn through the narrow birth canal. And the brisa we're about to study deals with the laws of Tuma Vitar.